I thought I was walking into a late celebration for turning 30, but the second I stepped inside, I realized this was not a party. It was a trial. My father pulled out a thick file. My mother refused to meet my eyes, and the room went dead silent. Then a voice rang out from the back, draining the blood from my parents' faces, because she was the one person who was never supposed to be here. My name is Sally Henderson, and I am currently sitting on the floor of an apartment that does not feel like home. It smells of cardboard and packing tape, the scent of a life hurriedly shoved into boxes and dragged across town. My coat is still draped over the back of a folding chair, one sleeve hanging down like a tired arm, because I have not yet found the energy to hang it up. I have been sitting here for 2 hours, staring at a stain on the carpet, trying to understand the physics of how a person can exist for 30 years and then, in the span of 60 minutes, simply cease to be who they thought they were. You might expect me to be screaming when people talk about betrayal, about family drama. They usually describe the heat of it. They talk about the red flush of anger, the smashing of plates, the screaming matches that leave your throat raw. But that is not what this is. This is not a fire. It is a freeze. It is a cold so absolute that it makes you look at the world through a sheet of ice. Everything looks distorted. Everything looks strange. I am looking at my own hands, the same hands I have had my entire life, and they look like they belong to a stranger. I am looking at the unboxed mugs on the counter, and I feel nothing but a profound, terrifying alienation. This morning, I brewed a pot of black coffee. I poured it into a travel mug, just like I do every single day. I took a sip, and the bitterness hit the back of my tongue, and for the first time in my life, I stopped. I actually stopped and asked myself a question that made my stomach turn. Do I even like black coffee? Or do I only drink it because my mother always told me that milk and sugar were for children? I can hear her voice in my head, sharp and clear as a bell, telling me that the women in our family drink it black, that we are strong, that we do not need to dilute the harshness of the world with sweetness. I have been drinking it black since I was 16 years old, 14 years of bitterness, swallowed every morning, because I thought it was a trait of my lineage. But if the lineage is a lie, what about the coffee? What about the way I fold my towels? What about the way I laugh? Or the way I fear failure? Or the way I hold a pen? How much of me is actually me? And how much is just a performance I was trained to give for an audience that was secretly laughing at the show? I turned 30 last week. That was supposed to be the milestone. I remember telling my colleagues at Fable West Consulting that this was going to be my year of stability. I had just closed a massive project, analyzing efficiency models for a mid-sized logistics firm. I was good at it. I was good at finding the waste, at trimming the fat, at looking at a column of numbers and telling you exactly where the value was hiding. I felt like an adult. I felt established. I thought I had built a foundation that was solid enough to hold a future. I bought a bottle of expensive champagne. I bought a dress. I thought I was walking into a celebration of the woman I had become. Instead, I walked into an audit. It feels strange to tell you this. There is a specific kind of guilt that comes with writing this down, a nausea that sits heavy in my gut. It feels like a betrayal. We are conditioned to protect our parents. We are taught from the moment we can speak that family is a fortress, and you do not open the gates to outsiders, even now, after everything they did, after the way they looked at me across that living room. A part of me wants to shut up. A part of me wants to bury this deep inside and pretend it never happened, because exposing them feels like exposing myself. It feels like admitting that my entire childhood was a fraudulent transaction, but I have to write it. I have to get it out of my body, because if I don't, I think the silence will choke me. My father did not give me a toast. He did not give me a hug. He gave me a folder. It was a thick, beige folder, the kind you see in legal offices or tax audits. He placed it on the coffee table with a heavy thud, a sound that cut through the chatter of the party like a gunshot. Inside, there was a spreadsheet. It was titled, Expenses 1995 to Present. He had itemized my existence, every piano lesson, every doctor visit, the cost of my braces, the price of the summer camp I went to when I was 12, the prom dress, the college tuition assistance. It was all there, row after row of black ink, tallied up to the cent. At the bottom, there was a total sum. It was a number in the mid-six figures, a number that represented the financial burden of keeping me alive. And then, he flipped the page. The DNA test was clipped to the back. It was clinical. It was cold. Probability of paternity 0%. Probability of maternity 0%. But even that wasn't the worst part. You might think the DNA was the climax. The moment the world shattered, it wasn't. The DNA was just paper. The spreadsheet was just numbers. I deal with numbers for a living. I can handle numbers. No. The thing that broke me, the thing that haunts me when I close my eyes in this empty apartment, was the crowd. There were nearly 80 people in that room. Aunts, uncles, cousins, friends of the family, neighbors I had known since I was in kindergarten. They were all standing there, holding their drinks, watching. And then, from the back of the room, a voice spoke up. I still get chills when I think about the tone of that voice. It wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It was just present. It cut through the tension like a razor blade. And when my parents heard it, when they looked up and saw who was standing there, the color drained from their faces so fast they looked like corpses. That person was never supposed to be there. That person was the variable they hadn't accounted for in their perfect calculation. That person was the ghost that was supposed to stay buried. But instead, she walked right into the living room and burned their script to the ground. I still call them Mom and Dad. I catch myself doing it in my head. I say, Mom would hate this rug, or Dad would say I'm wasting time. I don't know what else to call them. The plaintiffs? The investors? The words feel too sharp, too cynical. Even though they are accurate, the habit of love is a hard thing to break. Even when you realize the love was never returned in the way you thought it was, it is like a phantom limb. I reach out for them, for the comfort of the people who raised me, and I grasp nothing but air. I keep looking at the boxes in the corner. My life is packed away, waiting to be sorted. What do I keep? What do I throw away? How do I separate the memories that are real from the ones that are tainted? My father looked at me with the eyes of an accountant writing off a bad debt. My mother looked at the floor, twisting a napkin in her hands, refusing to acknowledge the human being standing in front of her. They did not see a daughter. They saw a mistake. They saw a cost center that had finally been closed out. I have spent the last 48 hours replaying every interaction I have ever had with them. I am looking for the cracks. I am looking for the moments where the mask slipped, where I should have known that I was not a child to them, but an obligation. I think about the way my father never really looked at my report cards, just nodded at the grades. I think about the way my mother never kept my childhood art, how the refrigerator was always pristine, never cluttered with the messy drawings of a kid who wanted to be seen. I thought they were just strict. I thought they were just private people. I didn't realize they were keeping the assets liquid, ready to divest at a moment's notice. There is a question that keeps spinning in my mind, a question that I think I will be trying to answer for the rest of my life. It is the question that drove me out of that house and into this cold, empty apartment. It is the question that makes me look at that coffee cup and wonder who I really am. If love has an invoice, then who collected the cash? Because I paid. I paid with my loyalty. I paid with my adoration. I paid with 30 years of trying to be the perfect daughter, trying to live up to standards that were impossible because they were never designed for me to meet them. I paid with every smile, every hug, every I love you that I gave them freely, thinking it was currency in a shared economy of affection. But it wasn't. I was pouring my heart into a black hole, and they were tallying up the cost of the groceries. I need to tell you how it happened. I need to walk you through it, step by step, so you can see the cruelty in the details. The devil isn't in the grand gesture. The devil is in the font size of the spreadsheet. The devil is in the warmth of the room before the ice age hit. The devil is in the fact that they let me walk in there, smiling, holding a bottle of cheap wine, thinking I was loved. Let me take you back to the beginning of the end. Let me tell you from the moment I started the car. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The sky was that bruised purple color you get in the Midwest right before a storm. But I didn't read anything into it. I was happy. I was singing along to the radio. I had a card in my purse that said, "To the best parents in the world." Because I was grateful. I was so incredibly, stupidly grateful for everything they had done for me. Let me tell you about the drive to the house that I thought was my home. The drive to Overland Park was a straight shot of asphalt and suburbia, the kind of drive you can do with your eyes closed, though I obviously didn't. I had the radio turned down low, a generic pop station that filled the silence without demanding my attention. I remember glancing at the digital clock on the dashboard. It was 6:45 in the evening. The sky out west was bruising over with purple and charcoal, threatening a storm that never actually broke, hanging there like a held breath. On the passenger seat beside me sat a bottle of Pinot Grigio. It was not a fancy bottle. It cost me $12.99 at the liquor store near my apartment. I had debated buying something better, something with a cork instead of a screw top, but I had talked myself out of it. My parents were not wine people. They were efficiency people. They drank to be polite, to mark an occasion, not to savor the notes of oak or blackberry. Spending $50 on a bottle of Cabernet would have been seen as a fiscal irresponsibility, a sign that I was not managing my finances with the prudence they had drilled into me since I was old enough to hold a piggy bank. So, the $12 Pinot it was, a sensible choice, a Henderson choice. I turned onto their street, a wide, curving avenue lined with oak trees that were perfectly spaced and perfectly trimmed. That was the thing about Overland Park. Nothing was ever out of place. The lawns were manicured to within an inch of their lives. The mailboxes were uniform, and the silence was heavy, like a velvet blanket laid over the neighborhood to smother any noise that might disturb the property values. I was humming along to the radio, thinking about the project I had just wrapped up at Fable West Consulting, feeling a rare lightness in my chest. I was 30 years old. I had a job I was good at. I had paid off my student loans 2 months early. I was arriving at my parents' house for a birthday dinner that I assumed would be the usual affair. A roast chicken, a store-bought cake, a card with a check inside, and a conversation about interest rates. It was predictable. It was safe. Then I saw the cars. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. I slowed the Hyundai down, my foot hovering over the brake, my brain trying to process the visual data that did not match the pattern of my life. The driveway was full, not just full, but packed. There was my father's pristine sedan, of course, but squeezed next to it were 3 other cars. And the street, both sides of the street in front of the house were lined with vehicles. I saw a silver Lexus I recognized as my Aunt Martha's. I saw the battered Ford truck that belonged to their landscape guy, which made no sense at this hour. I saw sedans and SUVs that looked vaguely familiar, like the cars of people I went to high school with or neighbors I hadn't spoken to in a decade. My stomach dropped. It was a physical sensation, like missing a step on a staircase. My first thought wasn't a party. My first thought was a tragedy. The Hendersons do not host. We do not throw mixers. We do not have open houses. My mother always said that having too many people in the house was a liability. A mess waiting to happen. If there were 20 cars parked outside my parents' house on a Tuesday evening, it meant someone had died. It meant there was an emergency so catastrophic that the rigid rules of their social seclusion had been suspended. I pulled my car into a tight spot 3 houses down. Squeezing between a minivan and a fire hydrant, I killed the engine and sat there for a moment, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. My heart was hammering against my ribs. Was it Dad? A heart attack? Was it Mom? A stroke? Why hadn't anyone called me? I checked my phone. No missed calls. No texts. The screen was black and silent. I grabbed the bottle of wine. A reflex, really. Clutching it like a weapon or a shield, and got out of the car. The air was cool, carrying the scent of cut grass and impending rain. I walked fast, my heels clicking on the pavement. the sound echoing too loudly in the quiet street. I didn't go to the front door. We never used the front door. The front door was for strangers and census takers. Family entered through the garage. I punched the code into the keypad mounted on the frame. 4 numbers. The year they bought the house. The heavy door rumbled and began to slide up, groaning on its tracks, as I ducked under the rising door and stepped into the garage. The smell hit me, and for a split second, the panic receded. It was the smell of my childhood. It was a specific cocktail of motor oil, sawdust, and the dry, dusty scent of old cardboard. This garage was my father's sanctuary. Though not in the way other men had sanctuaries, he didn't build things here. He didn't fix up old cars. He stored things. The shelves were lined with plastic bins, labeled with a label maker in my father's precise, angular font. Tax returns, 2001, Christmas decorations, exterior, spare parts, plumbing. It felt safe here. It felt orderly. I walked past the workbench that had never seen a speck of dirt, past the lawnmower that was wiped down after every use. I took a deep breath, letting that oily, dusty air fill my lungs. It grounded me. Okay, I told myself. Okay, if someone had died, the garage wouldn't feel this calm. If this were a medical emergency, there would be an ambulance in the driveway, not Aunt Martha's Lexus. This had to be a party. The realization washed over me with a strange mixture of relief and confusion. A surprise party? For me? It seemed impossible. My mother hated surprises. She considered them rude, a form of ambush. My father considered them a logistical nightmare, but here we were. 30 was a big number. Maybe, just maybe, they had decided to break character. Maybe they had softened. Maybe this was their way of showing me that they saw me, that they celebrated me, even if they had never been good at saying the words out loud. I looked at the door leading into the kitchen. It was a simple white door, the barrier between the concrete utility of the garage and the pristine interior of the house. I smoothed down my skirt. I checked my reflection in the side mirror of my father's car. I looked fine. I looked professional. I looked like a daughter who was ready to be surprised. I reached out, turned the knob, and pushed the door open. I expected noise. I expected the collective intake of breath, the sudden explosion of voices shouting a greeting, the pop of a confetti cannon, or at least the clinking of glasses and the hum of conversation. I expected warmth. Instead, I walked into a wall of cold air and absolute, suffocating silence. It was as if I had opened the door to a vacuum. The kitchen was packed, but it was silent. The living room beyond was full, but it was still. There were people everywhere. I did a quick head count in my peripheral vision. 50, 60, maybe nearly 80 people squeezed into the open plan downstairs, and not a single one of them was smiling. They were standing in clusters, holding plastic cups of punch or water, but they weren't drinking. They were facing the door. They were facing me. I froze on the doormat, the bottle of cheap Pinot Grigio dangling from my hand like a dead weight. The air conditioning was cranked up so high that goosebumps rose on my arms instantly. It felt like walking into a meat locker. I scanned the faces. I saw my high school English teacher. I saw the neighbors from across the street, the ones who always waved, but never stopped to talk. I saw cousins I hadn't seen since Christmas 3 years ago. I saw my boss from my first internship. It was a bizarre, eclectic collection of people from every stage of my life, a curated audience of witnesses, but their expressions were wrong. No one looked happy to see me. They didn't look excited. They looked uncomfortable. They looked like people waiting in a dentist's office, or people standing at the back of a church during a funeral service for someone they didn't like very much. There was a pity in their eyes, mixed with a morbid curiosity. They were watching me the way you watch a tightrope walker who is wobbling, waiting for the fall. "Surprise?" I whispered, the word dying on my lips. It came out as a question, weak and tremulous. No one answered. I stepped fully into the kitchen, the door clicking shut behind me. The sound was deafening in the quiet. I looked for my mother. I needed an anchor. I needed someone to explain the joke, to break the tension, to tell me that this was just a weird start to a fun evening. I found her standing near the kitchen island. She was wearing her navy blue dress, the one she wore to church on Easter and to weddings she didn't want to attend. She wasn't looking at me. Her head was bowed, her chin tucked into her chest. In her hands, she held a paper napkin, and she was twisting it. She was twisting it tight, wrapping it around her fingers until the tips turned purple, then unwinding it and starting again. It was a nervous tick I had never seen before. My mother was a woman of steel. She did not fidget, but right now, she looked terrified. She looked like a child who had broken a vase and was waiting for the punishment to come down. She refused to lift her eyes. She was staring at the floor tiles as if she wanted them to open up and swallow her whole. My gaze traveled past her, into the living room, to the fireplace. That was where my father stood. If my mother was the picture of shame, my father was the statue of authority. He was standing with his back to the unlit hearth, dominating the room. He was wearing his gray suit, the one he wore for board meetings. He wasn't holding a drink. He wasn't holding a gift. He was holding a thick beige file folder. His face was completely blank. It was the face he wore when he was balancing the checkbook, or when he was explaining to a contractor why their quote was unacceptable. It was devoid of emotion, devoid of warmth, devoid of fatherhood. He looked at me across the sea of silent heads, and his expression didn't flicker. He looked calm. He looked prepared. He looked like a man who was about to read a financial report to a room full of shareholders. My mind raced, desperately trying to construct a narrative that made sense. Maybe Mom was anxious because the catering was late. Maybe Dad was holding a collection of childhood photos, a scrapbook he had made for my 30th. Maybe the silence was just bad timing, a lull in the conversation that I had walked into by accident. "Dad?" I said, my voice sounding thin and foreign in my own ears. "Mom? What is all this?" My mother flinched. She actually flinched. Shrinking back against the granite counter, she still didn't look up. My father didn't move. He just adjusted his grip on the folder, tapping it once against the palm of his other hand. The sound was dry and sharp, like a judge's gavel hitting the wood. I took one more step forward, into the living room. I wanted to hug them. I wanted to laugh. I wanted to hand over my $12 wine and have someone pour me a glass and tell me I looked great. But as I took that step, the crowd parted slightly. They stepped back, creating a clear path between me and my father. It wasn't a path of welcome. It was the clearing of a stage. I looked at the faces of the guests again. I saw Aunt Martha looking at her shoes. I saw my old teacher biting her lip. I saw a neighbor whisper something to his wife, his eyes darting from me to the folder in my father's hand. And that was the moment the denial finally shattered. I realized that the coldness in the room wasn't just the air conditioning, it was coming from my parents. I realized that my mother wasn't hiding a surprise. She was hiding a secret. I realized that my father wasn't holding a scrapbook. He was holding an indictment. This wasn't a party. There was no cake. There were no balloons. There was no love here. I stood there, clutching my cheap bottle of wine, feeling the blood drain from my face, realizing with a sick, sinking certainty that I had walked into a trap. The surprise wasn't for me. The surprise was on me. And whatever was in that folder, whatever was about to happen in front of these 80 witnesses, was not going to be a celebration of my birth. It was going to be the dismantling of my life. My father cleared his throat. It was a small sound, but it echoed like a thunderclap. He opened the folder. I stopped breathing. The play was about to begin. The silence that followed the opening of that folder was so absolute that I could hear the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. It was a mechanical, indifferent sound that seemed to mock the sudden vacuum in the room. I was waiting for the punchline. I was waiting for my father to smile, for the tension to break, for the balloons to drop. I was waiting for him to say, "Happy birthday, Sally." He did not say happy birthday. He looked at me over the rim of his reading glasses, the same way he looked at a contractor who had gone over budget on a renovation. He adjusted his stance, planting his feet firmly on the hardwood floor as if bracing for a negotiation. "We need to talk about what we have invested," he said. His voice was not loud. It was terrifyingly conversational. It was the voice of a man discussing a portfolio readjustment, not the voice of a father addressing his daughter on a milestone birthday. The words hung in the air, grotesque and heavy. Invested, not raised, not loved, invested. He reached out and extended the folder toward me. It wasn't a gift. It was a summons. My hand moved automatically, a reflex born of 30 years of obedience. I took the folder. It felt heavy, dense with paper. My fingers were trembling so badly that the manila cardstock shook, making a soft fluttering sound. "Open it," he said. I opened it. The first page was not a card. It was a spreadsheet. It was printed in landscape mode. The columns perfectly aligned, the font a stark, professional Arial. Across the top, in bold, underlined letters, was a header that made my breath hitch in my throat. S.H. Expenses, 1995 to present. My eyes darted down the rows. It was a ledger. It was a comprehensive, line-by-line accounting of my entire existence. October, 1998. Orthodontic consultation, $150. January, 2000. Ballet lessons, spring term, $400. July, 2003. Summer camp, Lake Tahoe, $1,200. March, 2009. Emergency room visit, broken wrist, $540 copay. It went on, and on, and on. There were subtotals for clothing. There were categorized deductions for school supplies. There was a column for food, estimated based on the average caloric intake of a growing female child, adjusted for inflation. It was sick. It was meticulous. It was the work of weeks, maybe months. I stared at a line item from when I was 16. Prom dress alteration, $45. I remembered that dress. I remembered my mother pinning the hem, her mouth full of pins, telling me I looked beautiful. I had thought that moment was an act of love. According to this sheet, it was a billable hour. I felt a wave of nausea roll over me, hot and acidic. I looked at the bottom of the final page. There was a grand total, bolded and highlighted in gray, $248,612.43. That was the price tag. That was what I was worth. Or rather, that was what I had cost. I looked up at him, my vision blurring. I felt like I had been punched in the solar plexus. The cruelty of it was so specific, so curated. They hadn't just decided to kick me out. They had prepared a dossier. They had gone through bank statements. They had dug up old receipts. They had been planning this ambush while I was driving over here singing along to the radio. They had been planning this while I was buying that $12 bottle of wine that now sat on the floor near my feet. Looking absurd and pathetic, I looked around the room, desperate for someone to intervene. Surely, someone would step in. Surely, my Aunt Martha or my old teacher would say, "This is insane. Stop this. You are hurting her." But nobody moved. The silence had shifted. It wasn't just awkward anymore. It was electric with a dark, suffocating curiosity. People were whispering. I could hear the sibilant hiss of hushed conversations rippling through the crowd. They weren't looking at me with horror. They were looking at me with the wide-eyed, hungry stare of people watching a reality show wreck. They were leaning in. They wanted to see the total. They wanted to know the number. "Did you see the spreadsheet?" I heard a man whisper behind me. "He's got receipts," a woman murmured back. It was social horror. It was the realization that these people, my family, my community, were not my protectors. They were an audience, and my humiliation was the evening's entertainment. I looked at my mother again. "Please." I thought, "Mom, please, stop him." She was still looking at the floor, but now she was nodding. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, a slow, rhythmic nod, up and down, up and down. She wasn't nodding at me. She was nodding at the situation, confirming it, validating it. It was a gesture that said, "Yes, this is correct. Yes, the math checks out. Yes, we have to do this. She looked small, but she didn't look forced. She looked resigned, like she was finally purging a shameful secret she had kept in the attic for 3 decades. My father took a step closer to me. The intimacy of the movement made it worse. He reached out and flipped the page of the folder I was still holding. "Turn the page. Sally," he said. I didn't want to. I wanted to drop the folder and run. I wanted to get back in my car and drive until the gas tank was empty, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by the sheer weight of their authority. An authority I had never once questioned in 30 years. I looked at the second page. It was a document from a genetic testing laboratory. It was full of colorful bar graphs and scientific terminology that my brain refused to process. Alleles, markers, probabilities. But I didn't need to understand the science. I needed to understand the summary at the bottom. Paternity excluded. Maternity excluded. I stared at the words until they swam before my eyes. 0% match. I am not a biologist. I am a consultant. I understand data. And the data in my hands was telling me that the 2 people standing in front of me, the 2 people whose faces I saw in the mirror every morning, were strangers. My father spoke again, and this time, his voice carried to the back of the room. He wanted everyone to hear this part. He wanted the witnesses to understand the logic of his ledger. "The results are conclusive," he said. "You are not blood-related to us." He paused, letting the words sink into the carpet, into the walls, into my skin. "We have recently discovered this due to a health screening," he continued, his tone flattening into that of a lawyer reading a deposition. "There was a mix-up, a mistake at the hospital. We do not know the details. And frankly, the details are irrelevant to the bottom line." He gestured vaguely at the spreadsheet in my hand. "We have spent 30 years investing in this family," he said. "We have poured resources, capital, and time into raising a child. We did so under the assumption that we were investing in our own lineage. We were operating under a contract of biology." He took a breath, and then he delivered the line that I think will ring in my ears until the day I die. "We have no obligation to continue to pay for the life of a person who does not belong to us." The room seemed to tilt. I felt the blood rushing in my ears, a roaring sound like a waterfall. I looked at the crowd. I saw a cousin cover her mouth with her hand, but her eyes were bright with excitement. I saw my neighbor shake his head, not in disgust at my father, but in a sort of bewildered agreement, as if to say, "Well, he has a point. That is a lot of money for a stranger." It wasn't the DNA that killed me. I could have handled the DNA. People find out they are adopted all the time. People find out about hospital mix-ups. It is a tragedy, yes, but it is a tragedy that can be navigated with love. We could have cried. We could have held each other. We could have said, "It doesn't matter. You are still our daughter. We chose you every day for 30 years. But that is not what was happening here. The pain that sliced through me, sharp and clean as a scalpel, was the realization that I was not a person to them. I was a bad investment. I was a stock that had tanked. I was a piece of real estate that had turned out to have a cracked foundation. My father wasn't heartbroken that he had lost a daughter. He was angry that he had lost money. He was looking at me with the cold, hard pragmatism of a man who has just realized he has been paying the mortgage on the wrong house for 3 decades, and now he wanted to foreclose. I looked down at the spreadsheet again. The numbers were blurring, but one line stood out to me, crystal clear. December 2014, college tuition, fall semester, $12,000. I remembered that semester. I remembered calling home, crying because I was homesick, and my dad telling me to stick it out, that I was building a future. I thought he was encouraging me because he believed in me. Now I realized he was just protecting his asset. He didn't want the tuition to go to waste. I raised my head. My throat felt like it was full of broken glass. I tried to speak, but no sound came out. I was stripped bare. I was standing in the middle of my childhood home, surrounded by everyone I knew, holding a receipt for my own existence. My father checked his watch. It was a casual gesture. Dismissive. "We are correcting the error." He said, "We are stopping the bleed." He looked at the guests, then back at me. "This is a business decision. Sally, Shirley, with your job. You can understand that. You don't throw good money after bad." That was it. That was the summary of our relationship. Good money after bad. I looked at my mother one last time. She had stopped twisting the napkin. She was just standing there, her hands at her sides, her face a mask of tragic compliance. She had chosen her side. She had chosen the spreadsheet. She had chosen the man who kept the books over the girl she had tucked in at night. I felt a sudden, terrifying clarity. The shock was starting to recede, replaced by a cold, hollow ache in the center of my chest. I wasn't their daughter. I never had been. I was just a project that had failed the audit. And now, the project was being terminated. We found out 3 weeks ago. My father said he was speaking to the room now, not to me. He was addressing the jury. We ran a standard genetic screening. You know the kind. They check for hereditary risks, heart disease, glaucoma. We wanted to be responsible. We wanted to make sure our estate planning was based on accurate medical data. He tapped the folder again. The results came back with flagged anomalies. We ran them again, and then a third time. The lab confirmed it. There is no biological link. None. I was still staring at the paper in my hands. My brain had shut down. It had simply ceased to process the macro level of this disaster. I could not wrap my mind around the sentence, "You are not our daughter." So instead, my mind latched onto the micro. I fixated on a single row of text in the middle of page 1. Summer program, 2009, $650. I stared at that line until the black ink seemed to float off the page. I remembered that summer. I was 13. It was a leadership camp in the Ozarks. I remembered the smell of pine needles baking in the heat. I remembered learning how to kayak. I remembered writing a letter home every single day, telling them how much I missed them, how much I loved them. I remembered coming home with a friendship bracelet I had made for my mother, woven from cheap embroidery thread. She had worn it for exactly one afternoon before it disappeared into a drawer. $650. That was the value of my memories. That was the cost of the summer I learned to be brave. To my father, it wasn't a memory. It was a line item. It was a debit. It was money he had spent on a stranger. And now he wanted a refund on the sentiment. I looked at the 0% match on the second page. It felt like a grade. I had failed the test of existence. 0, nothing, a void where a person should be. And then, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It started from the corner of the room, near the bookshelf where my father kept his encyclopedias. Clap, a pause, clap, clap. It wasn't a slow clap of sarcasm. It was worse. It was the polite, measured applause you hear at the end of a quarterly earnings call. It was a cousin of mine, a man I had grown up with, a man who had taught me how to throw a spiral pass in the backyard. He was nodding, his face solemn, his hands coming together in a rhythm of agreement. He was applauding the logic. He was applauding the fiscal responsibility of cutting losses. Then, someone else joined in. My aunt. She set her wine glass down on a coaster. Always use a coaster. Sally. And she began to clap, too, lightly, politely. The sound spread. It wasn't thunderous. It wasn't a standing ovation. It was a ripple of soft, wet applause that moved through the crowd like a virus. They were agreeing with him. They were validating the audit. They were looking at me, standing there with my life in my hands, and they were clapping for the man who was destroying me. It was a performance, and they had decided that the villain of the play was the girl who had cost too much money. I felt like I was hallucinating. I looked around, desperate for one pair of eyes that held compassion, but all I saw was judgment. They looked at me like I was a parasite that had finally been detected. My father waited for the applause to die down. He didn't smile. He wasn't a monster who enjoyed this. He told himself. He was just a man doing what was necessary. And then he reached into the folder one last time. He pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was stapled at the top corner. "We have prepared this for you," he said. He slid it across the invisible barrier between us. I didn't want to take it. I wanted to let it fall to the floor. But my hands were still operating on the software of obedience installed in me since birth. I took it. It wasn't a letter of apology. It wasn't a guide on how to find my biological parents. It was a legal document. Termination of voluntary support and waiver of claims. The text was dense, single-spaced legalese. I saw words like severance and indemnification. I saw a clause that explicitly stated I would have no claim to the estate, no claim to the property, and no right to use the family name in any financial capacity. "Please sign at the bottom," my father said. He pulled a pen from his breast pocket. It was a Mont Blanc. I knew that pen. He had received it for his 25th anniversary at his firm. He clicked the cap off. "This outlines that we are dissolving the relationship," he said, his voice as dry as dust. "It states that you acknowledge the debt we have incurred in raising you, but that we are graciously choosing to write it off as a bad loan rather than suing you for restitution. It is a clean break. You walk away. We walk away. No future contact. No demands." He held the pen out to me. I looked at the pen. I looked at the document. "You want me to sign a contract?" I whispered. I can't believe I spoke. My voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. "You want me to sign a contract breaking up with me? It is for your protection as much as ours." He said, "My protection." I looked at my mother. She had moved slightly. She was no longer leaning against the counter. She was standing straight, her hands clasped in front of her. She looked like she was at a funeral, mourning a distant relative she hadn't really liked. "Mom," I said. The word hung there. Mom. It sounded like a lie now. She didn't look at me. She looked past my shoulder, toward the front of the house. "The suitcase is by the door," she said. Her voice was flat. Dead. There was no tremor in it. "What?" I asked. "Your things," she said. "We packed them this morning." I turned around. I looked toward the entryway, past the crowd of people who parted slightly to give me a view. There, sitting next to the coat rack, was a bag. It wasn't a new suitcase. It was my old high school gym bag, a blue duffel bag with the logo of the Overland Park Wildcats peeling off the side. It was bulging, the zipper strained, like things had been shoved into it without care. The breath left my body in a rush. They hadn't just prepared the paperwork. They hadn't just invited the audience. They had gone into my room, the room I still thought of as my room, with the poster of the solar system on the ceiling and the books I had loved as a teenager, and they had packed me up. They had touched my things. My mother had opened my drawers, taken out my old t-shirts, my spare jeans, the few personal items I kept there for when I visited, and she had removed them. She had erased me. While I was driving here, thinking about birthday cake, she was folding my life into a gym bag. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. It was so efficient. It was so Henderson. Why wait for me to pack? That would take time. That would be emotional. Better to have the asset ready for transport before the meeting even started. I looked back at her, and for the first time, I saw the truth. It wasn't just fear in her eyes. It was relief. She was glad I was going. She was glad the error was being corrected. She didn't want a daughter. She wanted a balanced ledger, and I had been in the red for too long. "You have 1 hour," my father said. I snapped my head back to him. "What? 1 hour?" he repeated. He checked his watch again. "It is 7:15. By 8:15, I expect you and your vehicle to be off the property. The locks will be changed tomorrow morning. The neighbors have been notified that you are no longer a resident and no longer welcome." He looked around the room. "We will not be serving dinner," he announced to the guests. "I apologize for the inconvenience, but I'm sure you all understand that under the circumstances, a celebration is inappropriate." No one objected. No one said, "Wait, you can't just kick her out. It's dark. She's your daughter." They just nodded. They murmured their understanding. "Of course. Difficult time. Best to handle it quickly." I felt a shaking start in my hands and travel up my arms, into my chest, until my whole body was vibrating. It was shock. It was rage. It was grief so profound it felt like I was dying. I stood up straighter. I could feel the tears pricking the back of my eyes, hot and stinging. I wanted to cry. I wanted to fall to my knees and beg them to tell me this was a nightmare. I wanted to scream until my throat bled, but I didn't. I looked at my father, holding his Mont Blanc pen. I looked at my mother, staring at the floor. I looked at the neighbors and the family who were watching me with that sickening mix of pity and judgment. If I cried, I became the victim. If I cried, I became the hysterical woman who was making a scene. If I cried, I validated their narrative that I was a burden, a mess, a problem to be solved. I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted copper. I locked my knees. I forced my breathing to slow down. I am not a mistake. I thought, I am Sally Henderson. I am a person. I did not take the pen. I let the termination agreement fall from my hand. It fluttered to the floor, landing face up on the pristine hardwood, right next to my cheap bottle of Pinot Grigio. I will not sign that, I said. My voice was quiet, but it was steady. My father's eyes narrowed. That is a mistake, Sally. I am not Sally. I said, not anymore, right? I turned my back on him. It was the hardest thing I have ever done, to turn my back on the man who had been the center of my universe for 30 years, to walk away from the fireplace, from the warmth, toward the cold draft of the door. I walked past my aunt, who wouldn't meet my eyes. I walked past my high school teacher, who pretended to be examining a painting on the wall. I reached the entryway. I looked down at the blue duffel bag. It looked pathetic, a whole life, reduced to a carry-on. I reached down and grabbed the handle. It was heavy. It smelled like my mother's laundry detergent. The smell almost broke me. It was the smell of safety, and it was coming from the bag that was serving as my eviction notice. I gripped the handle until my knuckles turned white. I was going to walk out that door. I was going to get in my car. I was going to drive away. And I was never going to look back. I took a step toward the garage door. Excuse me. The voice came from the back of the room. It wasn't a loud voice. It wasn't a shout. It was a clear, calm, resonant alto that cut through the murmuring of the guests like a bell. I stopped. My hand was on the doorknob. But I froze. My parents froze too. I could see them in the reflection of the hallway mirror. My father's head snapped up. My mother's hands flew to her mouth. It wasn't a voice I recognized, and judging by the look on my father's face, a look of pure, unadulterated terror, it wasn't a voice he had expected to hear tonight either. The crowd shifted. People turned around, confused. The wall of bodies parted, clearing a line of sight to the shadows near the back patio doors. A woman stepped forward. She was wearing a trench coat, belted at the waist. She had dark hair, wet from the rain that had finally started to fall outside. She didn't look like a guest. She didn't look like a neighbor. She looked like an executioner who had just arrived for her shift. My father dropped the folder. It hit the floor with a flat slap, the papers spilling out across the wood. The woman walked into the light. She looked at my parents, and then she looked at me, and for a second, the whole world stopped spinning. Because the face looking back at me wasn't a stranger's face. It was the face I had seen in old photo albums. It was the face of my father. Softened, feminized, but unmistakable. It was the face of the daughter they had thought was missing. The daughter they had thought was lost. Or perhaps, the daughter they had hoped would never show up. She wasn't supposed to be here. She took another step, her heels clicking on the floor. A sound that was louder than a gunshot in the silent room. I think, she said, looking straight at my father, you are evicting the wrong daughter. The woman who had stepped out of the shadows was not merely a disruption. She was a mirror. She stood near the sliding glass doors that led to the patio, framed by the dark, rainy night outside. She was about 30 years old, the same age I had turned last week. She had short, cropped brown hair that was styled in a way that suggested practicality over vanity. She wore a trench coat that was belted tightly at the waist, and beneath it, I could see the collar of a crisp white shirt. But it wasn't her clothes that made the air leave the room. It was her face. I looked at her, and then I looked at my father, and the resemblance was so visceral it made me nauseous. She had his nose, that sharp, slightly aquiline beak that I had always been told I didn't inherit because I took after my grandmother. She had his jawline, square and set with a tension that rippled beneath the skin, and she had his eyes. They were a piercing, icy blue, the exact shade of the man who had just handed me an invoice for my childhood. She was the biological reality standing in the face of his spreadsheet. The room was so quiet that I could hear the rain tapping against the glass behind her. My father was staring at her with his mouth slightly open, the composure of the boardroom completely shattered. My mother had gone pale, her hands gripping the edge of the kitchen island as if the floor were tilting beneath her feet. They clearly had not invited her. They didn't even seem to know she was in the state. She was a ghost who had walked in through an unlocked door. The woman took a breath, her chest rising and falling beneath the trench coat. She didn't look nervous. She looked angry. "My name is Harper Lane," she said. Her voice was steady, projecting to the corners of the room without shouting. "And I think you two are humiliating the wrong person. The name Harper Lane meant nothing to me, but it clearly meant something to my parents." My father took a step back, his heel catching on the edge of the rug. He looked like a man who had just seen a variable he couldn't control enter his carefully constructed equation. "Who let you in?" my father demanded. His voice was higher than usual, strained. "This is a private residence. You are trembling." "I didn't need an invitation," Harper said. "I walked in with the rest of the audience you summoned." She gestured to the crowd of 80 people who were now staring at her with slack-jawed fascination. The social horror had shifted. I was no longer the spectacle. I was the prologue. This was the main event. Harper didn't move toward them. Instead, she took a half step to the side, creating space for someone else to step forward from the cluster of guests near the bookshelf. A second woman appeared. She was older, perhaps in her 50s. Wearing a charcoal gray suit that looked expensive and severe. She held a leather briefcase in one hand and a pair of rimless glasses in the other. She radiated the kind of professional lethality that makes people straighten their posture instinctively. She walked right past Harper and stopped 3 feet from my father. She didn't look at the guests. She didn't look at the spreadsheet on the floor. She looked directly at the man who had just tried to evict me. She reached into her pocket and produced a business card. She held it out, not as a greeting, but as a notification. "My name is Monica Rourke." The woman said. Her tone was clipped, precise, and devoid of any social niceties. "I am the legal representative for the Lane family, and specifically for Ms. Harper Lane." My father didn't take the card. Monica didn't seem to care. She placed it on the mantelpiece next to a framed photo of me graduating from college, a photo that now felt like a prop in a long con. "We are not interested in talking to lawyers," my father spat out. "This is a family matter." It stopped being a family matter the moment you printed out a ledger and performed a public audit of a human being, Monica replied smoothly. She turned to face the room. She wasn't grandstanding. She was testifying. She spoke to the aunts, the uncles, the neighbors, and the friends who had been clapping just moments ago. The hospital error that occurred 30 years ago has been under investigation for 6 months. Monica stated, "We have subpoenaed the records, we have traced the shift logs, and we have conducted our own independent DNA testing, which Ms. Lane provided voluntarily." She paused, letting the weight of the legal investigation settle over the room. "The results are indisputable. Harper Lane is the biological daughter of Robert and Martha Henderson." A gasp went through the room. It wasn't the polite applause from earlier. It was a genuine, shocked intake of breath. The narrative had flipped. My parents had claimed they were cutting ties with a stranger to protect their resources, but now, the real daughter was standing there, and she wasn't running into their arms. She was standing next to a lawyer, looking at them with absolute disdain. But Monica wasn't finished. She opened her briefcase. The click of the latches was loud and sharp. She pulled out a file. It wasn't a beige folder like the one my father had used. It was a blue legal binder, thick with documents, We came here tonight because we received information that you were planning to liquidate certain assets and restructure your estate. Monica said. She looked at my father. We assumed you were doing this to prepare for the inevitable legal battle regarding the hospital switch. But after listening to your little presentation tonight, she glanced down at the termination agreement lying on the floor. I see that your motivation was far more urgent. She held up the blue binder. We have uncovered a series of financial irregularities, Monica said. Not regarding your money. Mr. Henderson, regarding Sally's. I blinked. My head was spinning. My money? I didn't have money. I had a salary. I had a savings account. I had a 401k. I was diligent, but I wasn't wealthy. What was she talking about? We have reason to believe, Monica continued, her voice hardening, that over the last 5 years, the Social Security number and personal identity of Sally Henderson have been used to co-sign loans, open lines of credit, and secure assets that do not appear on her personal credit report because they were hidden within family trusts. The room went dead silent. This wasn't just drama anymore. This was a crime scene. I looked at my father, for the first time all night. He looked terrified. The arrogance was gone. The accountant's mask had slipped, revealing the panic of a man who knows his books are being audited by someone he can't bully. That is a lie, my father stammered. His face was flushing a deep, mottled red. We managed her finances. We helped her. We were investing. You were leveraging. Monica cut him off. She took a step closer. You were using her clean credit history to cover bad debts in your own portfolio. And tonight? This performance? She gestured around the room. This was a cutoff. You weren't just kicking her out. You were trying to force her to sign a waiver of claims. You were trying to get her to legally absolve you of 30 years of financial identity theft before she even knew it had happened. You wanted to sever the tie so that when the creditors come looking, or when the hospital investigation goes public, Sally would have no standing to sue you. My knees finally gave out. I didn't fall, but I had to grab the doorframe of the garage entrance to keep myself upright. It wasn't just about the DNA. It was never just about the DNA. The DNA was just the excuse. They weren't evicting me because I wasn't their daughter. They were evicting me because I was a liability. They were done using me, and now they needed to dispose of the evidence before the new biological daughter started asking questions. I looked at my mother. She was shaking her head, tears streaming down her face. But they weren't tears of sorrow. They were tears of panic. She looked like a cornered animal. Harper stepped forward again. She walked past Monica, past the stunned guests, until she was standing in the center of the living room, directly between me and my parents. She looked at them. She looked at the parents she had probably dreamed of finding her whole life. She looked at the home that should have been hers. She looked at the wealth, the status, the perfectly manicured life of the Hendersons. And then she looked at me. I braced myself. I expected her to hate me. I was the cuckoo in the nest. I was the one who had lived her life, worn her clothes, spent her inheritance. I was the one who had received the 30 years of investment that my father had tallied up. But there was no hate in her eyes. There was a profound, aching sadness. She looked at my gym bag by the door. She looked at the spreadsheet on the floor. She looked at my face, which I knew was pale and stricken. I came here to meet them. Harper said softly. She wasn't speaking to the room anymore. She was speaking to me. I wanted to know where I came from. I wanted to know who they were. She turned her head slowly to look at my father, her eyes burning with a cold, blue fire. But I didn't expect them to be monsters. She said, the word hung in the air. Monsters. It wasn't a legal term. It was a moral judgment, delivered by the very bloodline they were so obsessed with preserving. And I didn't expect them to do this to you, she added. My father tried to rally. He straightened his tie, a reflex of his corporate training. You don't understand the situation, he said to Harper, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. You are listening to a lawyer who wants a payout. We are your family. We are the ones who— Stop, Harper said. She held up a hand. Just stop. She looked at the guests. I think this party is over, she said. My father took a step toward her. "Now wait a minute," he said, his voice dropping to a growl. "You cannot come into my house and dictate terms. This is a private family matter." Monica Rourke stepped in front of Harper, blocking my father's path. She was shorter than him, but she looked like she was made of granite. "I told you, Mr. Henderson," Monica said, her voice like a whip crack. "When you invited 80 witnesses to watch you humiliate a young woman, you forfeited your right to privacy. You made this a public spectacle, and now it is a legal matter." She pulled a folded document from her pocket and tossed it onto the coffee table. "Right on top of the DNA results. That is a cease and desist regarding the sale of any assets," Monica said, "and a notice of pending litigation for fraud, identity theft, and emotional distress." She turned to me. "Sally," she said. Her voice changed. It wasn't the voice of the shark anymore. It was gentle, calm. "Grab your bag." I looked at her. I looked at Harper. "You don't have to stay here," Monica said. "In fact, you shouldn't. Nothing in this house belongs to you anymore. And trust me, you don't want it to." I looked at my parents one last time. My father was staring at the legal notice on the table, his face gray. My mother was sobbing into her hands. But nobody was comforting her. The guests were backing away, the circle widening, distancing themselves from the contamination of the Henderson family name. They looked small. They looked pathetic. They looked like two people who had spent their whole lives counting pennies and had just realized they were bankrupt in the only currency that mattered. I understood then. The person in the crowd hadn't just saved me from signing that document. She had flipped the entire board. I wasn't the victim of a tragedy anymore. I was a witness to a crime. And the people I had spent my life trying to please were not giants. They were just thieves. I reached down and picked up the handle of my blue duffel bag. It felt lighter now. I walked toward the door. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't look back at the spreadsheet. I walked past my father, who didn't even look up. I walked past my mother, who was weeping for herself, not for me. I stopped next to Harper. She was watching me. We stood there for a second. Two strangers who had been swapped in the cosmic lottery. Two women whose lives had been defined by the same lie. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I shook my head. "Don't be," I said. My voice was raspy, but it was mine. "You didn't do this." I walked out of the living room, through the kitchen, and into the garage. The smell of oil and sawdust hit me again. But this time, it didn't smell like safety. It smelled like a cage I had finally escaped. I stepped out into the rain. It was cold, but it felt clean. I walked to my car, threw the bag in the passenger seat, and got in. As I fumbled for my keys, I saw the front door of the house open. Harper and Monica walked out. They didn't stay to reconcile. They didn't stay to have a family reunion. They walked out, leaving my parents alone in a house full of people who now knew exactly who they were. I started the engine. The radio came on, still playing the same pop station. But I turned it off. I needed silence. I needed to think. I put the car in reverse and backed out of the space, leaving the $12 bottle of Pinot Grigio on the floor of the living room, right next to the invoice for my life. I was driving away with nothing but a gym bag and a broken heart, but for the first time in 30 years, I wasn't driving toward a lie. I was driving away from one. I drove until the city limits of Overland Park faded into the ragged edge of the highway. I did not cry. I did not scream. I drove with the mechanical precision of a machine that had been programmed to keep moving because stopping meant acknowledging that the engine had fallen out. My hands were at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. My turn signals were used correctly. I obeyed the speed limit. It was a terrifying performance of normalcy from a woman who had just been legally and emotionally amputated from her own life. I pulled into the parking lot of a 24-hour diner called The Skillet. It sat alone near the interstate off-ramp, a beacon of neon yellow and grease. I needed to be somewhere that didn't care who I was. I needed bright lights, sticky tables, and the sound of silverware clattering against ceramic. I needed the world to be loud and ordinary so I wouldn't hear the silence in my own head. I walked inside. The air smelled of bacon and stale coffee. A waitress with tired eyes and a name tag that read, Brenda pointed to a booth in the back without saying a word. I sat down. The vinyl seat was cracked and cold against my legs. Coffee? Brenda asked, pulling a pad from her apron. Yes, I said. And pancakes. I wasn't hungry. The thought of food made my stomach contract. But I ordered them because that is what people do in diners. They eat pancakes. They drink coffee. They exist. I needed to anchor myself to the physical world before I floated away completely. I placed my gym bag on the seat across from me. It sat there like a person, bulky and blue, holding the pathetic sum of my immediate possessions. Beside it, I placed the folder. I must have gripped it the entire time. I didn't remember taking it. I didn't remember walking out of the house with it. My father had handed it to me, the invoice for my life, and my body had held on to it even as my mind shattered. It was instinct, I suppose. The same instinct that makes you grab your wallet during a fire. It was mine. It was the only record of who I was, even if that record was a lie. I slid the folder open. The spreadsheet was still there on top, the rows of numbers staring up at me under the harsh fluorescent lights. But as I rifled through the pages, I found something else tucked into the back pocket of the folder. It was a crisp, white envelope with a heavy linen texture. It wasn't from my father. I realized then that Monica Rourke, the lawyer, must have slipped it into the stack when she placed the cease and desist order on the table. Or perhaps she had slid it into my hand during the chaotic exit and I had shoved it in here without thinking. I opened the envelope. Inside was a photocopy of a hospital birth record from 1995. It showed a timestamp. It showed a room number, and it showed 2 names, Henderson and Lane. The babies were born 14 minutes apart. Clipped to the birth record was a letter on Monica's letterhead. It was brief. Ms. Henderson, I know this is overwhelming. Please do not navigate this alone. The Lane family, your biological family, wants to meet you, but on your terms. When you are ready, call this number. In the meantime, do not sign anything your parents give you. Do not agree to any debt. We have evidence that your financial identity is more entangled with theirs than you realize. I read the letter 3 times. Your biological family. The words felt foreign, like a language I hadn't learned yet. I looked at the birth record again. 14 minutes. That was the margin of error. That was the difference between the life I had lived and the life Harper Lane had lived. 14 minutes and a nurse who was probably tired, or distracted, or just human. Brenda dropped a plate of pancakes in front of me. The syrup was already poured, pooling in the corners of the plate. Anything else? She asked. I shook my head. She walked away. I pushed the pancakes aside and pulled my phone out of my pocket. The screen was bright in the dim booth. I had 7 unread notifications. None of them were from my mother. None of them were from my father. They were from apps, news alerts, weather updates. The digital world churned on, indifferent to the fact that I had just become an orphan. I opened my email. I needed to write to my boss at Fable West Consulting. It was Tuesday night. I was supposed to be in a strategy meeting at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. I stared at the compose window. Subject line. What do you write? Emergency? Personal crisis? I typed, urgent, sick leave. My fingers hovered over the keys. I couldn't tell him the truth. I couldn't write. Dear Mark, I cannot come in tomorrow because my parents just presented me with a bill for $200,000 and kicked me out of the family because I am a genetic error. It sounded insane. It sounded like the plot of a bad movie. If I wrote that, he would think I was having a psychotic break. So I lied. I fell back on the socially acceptable script of corporate America. Hi, Mark. I have come down with a severe case of the stomach flu. I will not be able to make the strategy meeting tomorrow. I will try to be online by Thursday, but I need 24 hours to recover. My apologies for the late notice. I hit send. The lie tasted like ash in my mouth. Stomach flu. It was so small, so manageable. It was a problem that could be solved with ginger ale and sleep. My real problem was a cancer that had metastasized over 30 years. I turned my attention back to the spreadsheet. my father's masterpiece. I started reading the line items again, this time with the cold, analytical eye of the consultant I was paid to be. I stopped looking at the emotional weight of the entries, the piano lessons, the prom dress, and started looking at the data. I traced my finger down the column for the year 2018. Home renovation, kitchen and master bath, $15,000. I stopped. I frowned. In 2018, I was 22 years old. I was living in Chicago, working my first junior analyst job. I was paying rent on a studio apartment that smelled like curry and old cigarettes. I hadn't lived in the Overland Park house for 4 years. Why was a $15,000 renovation listed under SH expenses? I looked further down. Landscaping overhaul. Spring 2019, $4,000. Vehicle maintenance. Lexus RX, 2020, $1,200. My heart started to beat faster. A hard, rhythmic thud against my ribs. I didn't drive a Lexus. My mother drove a Lexus. These weren't my expenses. These were their expenses. I flipped to the summary page. My father had categorized these costs under support and maintenance. He had buried them in a sea of legitimate costs like tuition and medical bills, hiding the fraud in plain sight. He had assigned the cost of their lifestyle to the ledger of my debt. This wasn't just pettiness. This wasn't just a father trying to make a point about how expensive children are. This was accounting fraud. A chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning slid down my spine. Monica Rourke's words echoed in my head. We have evidence that your financial identity is more entangled with theirs than you realize. Why would they list their kitchen renovation as my debt? Unless they had paid for it using money that was legally mine? Or unless they were building a paper trail to justify seizing assets I didn't even know I had. I thought about the tax returns my father always insisted on filing for me. It's complicated. Sally, he would say, let me handle it. I have a guy. I had always said thank you. I had always signed where he put the sticky note. I had never looked at the numbers. I felt a sudden, sharp clarity. This evening wasn't an emotional outburst. My father didn't do emotional outbursts. This was a preemptive strike. They knew the truth about the baby switch was coming out. They knew they were about to lose control of the narrative. So they tried to bankrupt me, morally and perhaps literally, before I could look at the books. My phone buzzed on the table, startling me. I jumped, knocking a fork onto the floor with a loud clang. I picked up the phone. It was a text message from a number I didn't recognize. I am sorry we met this way. I was thrown into this too. I didn't know they were going to do that to you. Harper. I stared at the screen. Harper, the woman with my father's eyes, the woman who had stood in the living room and called them monsters. She had my number. Monica must have given it to her. I didn't know how to reply. What do you say to the person who is living the life you were supposed to have? Thanks? It's okay? It wasn't okay. I typed, it's not your fault. I hesitated, then added, thank you for stepping in. I sent it before I could overthink it. I paid the bill. I left the pancakes untouched. I walked back out to my car, clutching the folder and the blue gym bag. I drove to my new apartment, the one I had been sitting in at the beginning of this story, the one with the boxes. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The silence of the apartment was different from the silence of the diner. It was personal. It was the silence of a life that had been paused. I dropped the gym bag on the floor. I hung my coat on the chair. I sat down on the carpet, right where I had started, and looked at the blank white walls. Tomorrow was Wednesday. The sun would rise. The world would expect me to be Sally Henderson, but I didn't know who Sally Henderson was anymore. Was she a daughter? No. Was she a victim? I refused to be. I looked at the folder lying on the carpet next to me. I looked at the spreadsheet that claimed I owed them $250,000. Fear is a paralyzed state. I had been afraid in that living room. I had been afraid in the car. But as I sat there, looking at the fraudulent line item for a kitchen renovation I had never asked for, the fear began to curdle into something else. It turned into cold, hard curiosity. They wanted to reduce me to a number. They wanted to turn our relationship into a transaction. They thought that by presenting me with a bill, they could crush me under the weight of my own gratitude and guilt. They forgot one thing. They forgot who they raised. They raised a consultant. They raised a woman who spent 10 hours a day looking for patterns in data, finding the leaks, identifying the waste. They had trained me to be the very thing that could destroy them. I reached for the folder. I opened it again. I grabbed a pen from my purse. I wasn't going to sleep tonight. If they wanted to talk about investment, fine. We would talk about investment. I was going to audit every single line of this spreadsheet. I was going to find every lie, every inflated cost, every dollar they had stolen from my name to pay for their comfort. They thought they had closed the account, but they were wrong. The audit was just beginning. The law office of Monica Rourke was nothing like the polished, glass and steel firm my father used for his corporate dealings. It was located in a strip mall, wedged between a dry cleaner and a dentist's office. The waiting room smelled faintly of lemon polish and old carpet. There were no expensive art pieces on the walls, just framed certificates and a few generic prints of lighthouses. It was small. It was humble. And for the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe without my chest constricting. I walked in at 10 o'clock on Thursday morning. I had spent the previous day in a fugue state, alternating between sleeping and staring at the spreadsheet my father had given me, highlighting the inconsistencies with a yellow marker until the page looked like a bruised banana. I felt hollowed out, scraped clean of the person I used to be. Harper was already there. She was sitting in one of the two guest chairs, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She was wearing a soft gray sweater and jeans, a stark contrast to the trench coat armor she had worn the night of the party. When I walked in, she looked up, and I saw the raw evidence of the aftermath. Her eyes were rimmed with red, the skin beneath them puffy and dark. She looked like she hadn't slept either. She looked like a woman who had found her origin story, only to discover it was a horror genre. "Sally," she said. It wasn't a greeting, it was an acknowledgement of shared survival. I sat down next to her. The chair creaked. The air in the room was thick, charged with the peculiar, suffocating awkwardness of two strangers who are intimately connected by a biology they did not choose. We were sitting knee to knee, shoulder to shoulder, sharing the same nose, the same chin, the same DNA, yet we were complete strangers. Monica Rourke came out from the back office. She looked tired, but sharp, her glasses perched on the end of her nose. She closed the door behind her, shutting out the noise of the receptionist's typing. "Thank you for coming," Monica said. She sat behind her desk, which was piled high with files. "I think it is time we put all the cards on the table. No more theatrics, no more speeches, just the facts." I nodded. I wanted facts. Facts were safe. Facts were just numbers with context. Monica opened a file. "Let's start with the switch," she said. She explained it in low, measured tones. It happened at Overland Park General in 1995. A busy night, a shift change. Two bassinets rolled into the nursery at the same time. The wristbands were loose. It was the kind of human error that lawsuits are made of. The kind of mistake that ruins lives in the span of 30 seconds. The Lanes, Harper's parents, had suspected something for a long time. Monica said, Harper didn't look like them. She didn't act like them. But they loved her. They raised her. They didn't want to pull the thread because they were afraid of what would unravel. Harper spoke up then. Her voice was quiet, lacking the projected confidence she had used to silence my father. "My parents are good people," she said. She looked at her hands. "We didn't have much money growing up. My dad is a mechanic. My mom teaches 3rd grade. We lived in a small house in Raytown, but I never felt tallied." She glanced at me, then looked away quickly, as if afraid she had insulted me. "I always wondered, though," Harper continued. "I used to daydream about it. You know how kids are. I thought maybe my real parents were royalty, or famous spies, or just, I don't know, different." She let out a dry, humorless laugh. "When the health screening came back last year, and we realized the truth, I pushed for the investigation. I wanted to meet them. I built this whole fantasy in my head. I thought it would be a movie moment. I thought I would walk up to the door, and they would cry, and we would hug, and suddenly everything would make sense. She paused, swallowing hard against a lump in her throat. I didn't think I would walk into an auction, she whispered. The word hung in the air. Auction. I looked at Harper, really looked at her. I realized with a sudden jolt of clarity that I did not hate her. I had expected to. I had expected to feel a burning jealousy for the rightful heir. The woman who belonged in the photos on the mantelpiece. But I didn't. I felt sorry for her. She had come looking for connection, and instead, she had witnessed the people who shared her blood treating a human being like a depreciating asset. She had watched her biological father hand me an invoice. That was her introduction to her lineage. I had lost my parents, yes, but she had lost the possibility of them, in a way. Her loss was cleaner, but sharper. I saw what they did to you, Harper said, turning to face me. The way they looked at you, like you were a mistake they were trying to erase. It broke me. Sally, I stood there in the back of that room, and I felt my heart turn to stone. If that is how they treat the daughter they raised for 30 years, what hope do I have? I am just a stranger with the right blood type. You are the real daughter, I said. The words tasted like copper. Harper shook her head violently. No, she said, there is no such thing. Not after Tuesday night. There are just two victims here, one they lied to, and one they are trying to use. Monica cleared her throat. She pulled a piece of paper from the file. Speaking of lies, she said. She slid the paper across the desk toward me. It was a billing statement from a private laboratory. It was dated 5 years ago. We found this during the discovery phase of the Lane family's investigation. Monica said, it was buried in a subpoenaed credit card statement from your father's personal accounts. I looked at the date. 2021. 5 years ago. Monica said, they paid for a private DNA test, not a health screening, a paternity test. They used a sample from a hairbrush. We have the correspondence with the lab. The room seemed to tilt. They knew? I asked. My voice was barely a whisper. They knew 5 years ago? Monica nodded. They knew. They received the results confirming you were not their biological daughter 5 years ago. I sat back in the chair. The breath knocked out of me. The story my father had told at the party. The story about the recent health screening. The shock, the sudden need to cut ties, was a fabrication. It was a lie designed to garner sympathy from the audience. They knew. I repeated. And they didn't tell me. They kept playing the part. They kept sending birthday cards. They kept criticizing my career choices. They kept pretending. Why? I asked. Why wait 5 years? Why do it now? On my 30th birthday? Monica leaned forward. Because of the statute of limitations, she said, and because of the Lanes. She pointed to Harper. When Harper's family started asking questions 6 months ago, your parents panicked. Monica explained. They knew the truth was coming out. They knew they couldn't hide the switch anymore. But they also knew something else. They knew that if they admitted they had known for 5 years and done nothing, they could be liable for fraud. Fraud? I asked. Harper took a deep breath and interjected. They contacted me. Sally. I looked at her. When? 2 months ago. Harper said. Before the party. They reached out to me through a private investigator. They didn't want to meet me. They didn't want to know if I was happy or healthy. She clenched her jaw. They wanted to know about my credit score. She said. I stared at her. What? They asked the investigator to run a background check on me. Harper said. They wanted to know if I had debt. They wanted to know if I was litigious. They sent a message through an intermediary essentially asking if I was manageable. She looked at me with those icy blue eyes that were so much like my father's, but filled with a warmth he never possessed. They talked about the legacy. Harper said. They talked about the estate. They talked about preserving the Henderson name. They never once asked about me as a person. They treated me like I was a merger acquisition they were vetting. I felt the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with a terrifying mechanical precision. The party, the guests, the spreadsheet. It wasn't an emotional reaction, it was a controlled demolition. They knew the lanes were coming. They knew they had to swap daughters. But they didn't want to just swap us. They wanted to balance the books. They wanted to cut me loose, but they needed a reason that made them look like the victims. I said, thinking out loud, if they just kicked me out, they would look like monsters. But if they staged a scene, if they showed everyone how much I had cost them, if they claimed I was a leech, then they get to control the narrative. Monica finished. They paint you as the financial burden. They paint themselves as the deceived benefactors. And most importantly, they try to force you to sign that waiver. The waiver. The document I had left on the floor. They wanted to make sure I couldn't sue them for the 5 years they knew and didn't tell me. I said, and they wanted to make sure I couldn't sue them for. I trailed off, thinking about the weird expenses in the spreadsheet, the kitchen renovation, the landscaping, for the money they stole, Monica said. She tapped the blue binder she had brought to the party. We are still digging. Sally, but it looks like they have been using your identity as a shield. They put assets in your name to hide them from taxes, and they put debts in your name to keep their own credit clean. The spreadsheet wasn't just an insult, it was a cover-up. They were trying to convince you that you owed them, so you wouldn't look closely enough to realize that they actually owe you. I felt a cold rage settling in my stomach. It was heavier than the grief. It was solid. It was useful. They didn't just break my heart. I said, they tried to break my future. Monica nodded. Exactly. And that is why we are going to fight them. Not with emotions, not with drama, but with forensic accounting. We sat there for a moment, the three of us, in the quiet hum of the office. The reality of it was staggering. My parents were not just cold. They were criminal. They were not just bad parents. They were bad people. Harper stood up. I am not going to let them have you, she said. I don't mean that in a possessive way. I mean, I am not going to step into your shoes and let them erase you. I told Monica, I will not accept a relationship with them if it means displacing you. I looked up at her. You don't have to do that. They are your parents. They are biologically related to me, Harper corrected. But they are not parents. Parents don't keep ledgers. She held out a hand to me. Come on, she said. Let's get some air. It smells like toner fluid in here. I took her hand. Her grip was firm, warm, and real. We walked out of the office together, leaving Monica to her piles of evidence. We stepped out onto the sidewalk. The rain from Tuesday had cleared, and the sun was shining with a harsh, bright indifference. There was a large glass window on the front of the dry cleaner next door. As we walked past it, we both stopped. We saw our reflections side by side. It was the first time I'd really seen us together. The resemblance was undeniable. We had the same height. We had the same build. Broad shoulders, narrow waists. We had the same way of standing. Weight shifted to one hip. But there were differences, too. Differences that had nothing to do with biology and everything to do with the 30 years that separated us. Harper stood with a kind of easy looseness. She had laugh lines around her eyes. Faint but there. Her hands were rougher than mine. Calloused perhaps from a life that involved more doing and less analyzing. She looked like someone who had been held. She looked like someone who had been allowed to make mistakes without them being entered into a spreadsheet. I looked at my own reflection. My posture was rigid. My jaw was set tight. My eyes were guarded, constantly scanning for threats. I looked polished, expensive, and incredibly brittle. I looked like a woman who had spent 3 decades trying to earn her place on the earth, terrified that if she slipped up, the rent would come due. We look alike, I said. Harper looked at the reflection, tilting her head. We do. She agreed. But you look tired. Sally, I am tired, I admitted. I have been tired for 30 years. Harper turned away from the glass and looked at me directly. Well, she said, you don't have to carry the bill anymore. We are going to shred it. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a set of car keys. My dad, my real dad, the one who raised me, "He wants to meet you," she said. "He is making brisket. He says you probably need a hot meal that doesn't come from a diner." I hesitated. The idea of walking into another family's home, another set of parents, was terrifying. I felt raw. I felt like an exposed nerve. No expectations. Harper promised. No spreadsheets, just brisket, and maybe a beer. I looked at her. I looked at the sister I never knew I had, the woman who had saved me from signing away my life. "Okay," I said. "Okay," she repeated. We walked toward her car. It was a beat-up Honda, dusty and cluttered with coffee cups. It was the complete opposite of the pristine, silent cars I had grown up in. I got in the passenger seat. It smelled like vanilla air freshener and dog hair. It smelled like a life that hadn't been itemized. For the first time since Tuesday, I didn't feel like I was plummeting. I felt like I had hit the ground. It was hard, and it hurt, but at least I wasn't falling anymore, and I wasn't alone. The glow of my laptop screen was the only light in the apartment. It was 3 o'clock in the morning on Friday, and the silence of the room felt heavy, like a physical weight pressing against my eardrums. I had not slept. I had not eaten the brisket Harper's father had offered, though I had packed the leftovers in a plastic container that now sat in my empty refrigerator. I was doing what I did best. I was following the money. Monica had given me the access codes to a comprehensive credit monitoring service, a professional-grade tool that went deeper than the free apps on my phone. I had spent the last 4 hours staring at a digital reconstruction of my financial existence, and what I found made the betrayal in the living room look like a playground skirmish. I scrolled down to the section labeled Open Revolving Accounts. There were the usual suspects: my primary credit card, my student loan, which was marked as paid in full, and my car lease. But then, there were the ghosts. A credit card opened in 2021 with a limit of $25,000. Balance: $24,800. A personal line of credit opened in 2022. Limit: $50,000. Balance: $49,000. A home improvement loan taken out in 2019. Amount: $30,000. I stared at the screen, blinking rapidly, trying to make the numbers rearrange themselves into something that made sense. I did not open these accounts. I had never seen these cards. I had never signed these papers. I clicked on the details for the home improvement loan. I downloaded the original application PDF. There, at the bottom of the page, was a signature. Sally Henderson. It was a good forgery. It had the same loop on the S that I used. It had the same sharp, angular H. To a bank teller or a loan officer who didn't know me, it would look legitimate, but I knew my own hand. I knew the pressure points of my own penmanship. The tail of the Y was too short. The spacing was too even. It was a signature drawn by someone who had practiced it. Someone who had studied my report cards and my birthday thank you notes for 30 years. I looked at the mailing address on the application. It wasn't my Chicago apartment, where I was living in 2019. It was an address in Overland Park, a post office box I didn't recognize. I opened a new tab and searched the P.O. box number. It was located at a shipping center 3 miles from my parents' house. I felt a coldness spread through my chest, radiating outward from my heart until my fingers felt numb on the trackpad. This wasn't just identity theft. This was custodial predation. My father, the man who preached fiscal responsibility like a religion, had been using my credit score as his personal slush fund. Then, I remembered something. A memory surfaced from the depths of my childhood, innocuous at the time, now sinister. I was 22, just out of college. I had come home for a weekend to pick up some documents. My birth certificate, my social security card. I needed them for my new job. I remembered standing in the study, reaching for the files. My father had stepped in, gently moving my hand away. "Let me keep these for you. Sally," he had said. His voice was warm, protective. "You know how chaotic moving can be. You don't want these getting lost in a box somewhere. I have the fireproof safe. They are safer here. I'll just scan them and email you the copies." I had thanked him. I had thought he was being a good father. I had thought he was protecting me from my own disorganization. He wasn't protecting the documents. He was hoarding the keys to my identity. He needed to keep them close so he could continue to leverage me. I looked over at the gym bag on the floor, where the expenses spreadsheet still sat. Suddenly, the purpose of that horrific document shifted in my mind. I had thought it was a tool of humiliation. I had thought it was designed to shame me into leaving. But as I looked at the fraudulent loans on my screen, loans that totaled over $100,000, I realized the spreadsheet wasn't an emotional weapon. It was a legal shield. The total on the spreadsheet was roughly $250,000. The amount of debt they had racked up in my name was probably half that. Maybe more if I kept digging. If I ever found out about the fraud and tried to sue them, they would pull out the spreadsheet. They would claim that the money they took was simply reimbursement for the costs they had incurred. They would argue that it was a family arrangement, a way of balancing the ledger. They would say, "Yes, we used her credit, but look at what we spent on her. It's a wash." The spreadsheet was their insurance policy. They were building a defense against an embezzlement charge before I even knew I was being embezzled. I grabbed my phone and dialed Monica. It was 5 a.m., but she picked up on the second ring. "Rourke," she answered, her voice raspy with sleep, but instantly alert. "They are not just cutting me off." I said, "I didn't say hello. They are balancing the books. The spreadsheet is an offset strategy." There was a pause on the line. I heard the rustle of sheets, then the click of a lamp turning on. "Explain." Monica said, "I told her about the loans. I told her about the P.O. box. I told her about the forgery. If I sue them for the $100,000 they stole," I said, "they will countersue me for the $200,000 in raising expenses and claim I verbally agreed to pay them back. That's why they wanted me to sign the waiver. The waiver wasn't just to get rid of me. It was to lock in the narrative that I owed them." "Smart," Monica muttered. "Evil, but smart. It muddies the waters. It turns a criminal case into a domestic civil dispute. Juries hate domestic disputes. They call it family drama and wash their hands of it. So what do? I asked. "Do I go over there? Do I confront them?" "No," Monica said sharply. "Absolutely not. If you go over there screaming about fraud, they will record you. They will edit the audio. They will make it look like you are extorting them. Pay me off, or I tell everyone about the baby switch. They will flip the victim script so fast your head will spin. Then how do we stop them?" "We don't stop them," Monica said. "We bury them. But we need more paper. I need you to sign a frantic array of affidavits authorizing me to pull everything: bank statements, tax returns. If they claimed you as a dependent one day past your graduation, that is federal tax fraud. If they forged your signature on a loan application, that is bank fraud. We aren't going to sue them for being bad parents. Sally, we are going to report them for federal crimes." I hung up the phone. I felt a strange vibration in my hand. It was another text, this time from Harper. I remembered something else. The text read, "About a year ago, before the investigator contacted me." I saw a text on my burner phone, the one the investigator used. It was forwarded from your mom to the intermediary. It said, "We need to resolve the name issue on the deed before the end of the fiscal year. It's getting too risky." I didn't know what it meant then. I thought they meant my name. Now I think they meant yours. "The deed?" I froze. I opened a new browser tab. I went to the county recorder's website. I searched for my parents' address in Overland Park. The property history loaded. Current owner, the Henderson Family Trust. I clicked on the trust details. Beneficiaries: Robert Henderson, Martha Henderson. And then, a modification dated 6 months ago. Removed beneficiary: Sally Henderson. That wasn't the smoking gun, though. The smoking gun was the listing status on a different site I checked next. Zillow, coming soon. Prestigious Overland Park Estate. Market launch. Monday. They were selling the house. They were liquidating. They were cashing out the equity. Equity that might have been built partly with the money they stole from my credit lines. And they were going to disappear. They were going to take the money, move to Florida or Arizona, and leave me with a ruined credit score and a box of memories I couldn't look at. I looked at the clock. It was 7 a.m. I had to go to work. The thought seemed absurd. How could I go to work? How could I sit in a meeting about supply chain efficiency when my entire life was a crime scene? But I had to. I needed the health insurance. I needed the salary. And more than that, I needed to know if I was still capable of functioning in the real world. I showered. I dressed in my sharpest blazer. I put on makeup to hide the dark circles that looked like bruises under my eyes. I drove to Fable West Consulting. I walked into the office at 8:45. The fluorescent lights hummed. The coffee machine hissed. It was aggressively normal. Mark, my boss, was in his office. He was a man of few words, focused on results. I had emailed him about the stomach flu, but here I was. I knocked on his door. "Sally?" he asked, looking up from his dual monitors. "I thought you were sick." I closed the door behind me. I sat down. I lied. I said, Mark raised an eyebrow. He took off his glasses. "Okay, that's a bold opener. I don't have the stomach flu." I said, "I have a situation, a legal and financial situation involving identity theft and immediate family fraud." I didn't give him the emotional sob story. I didn't tell him about the birthday party or the heartbreak. I gave him the executive summary. My identity has been compromised by a close relation. I said, significant financial liabilities have been incurred in my name without my consent. I am currently working with legal counsel to resolve this, but it will require forensic accounting and court appearances. I came in today because I didn't want to lie to you, and because I need to know if my job is safe while I fight this war. Mark looked at me for a long time. He was analyzing me. He was assessing the risk. Then, he leaned back in his chair. "You are the best analyst I have," he said. "You saved the logistics project last month." He picked up his phone and dialed an extension. "HR? This is Mark. I need the contact info for our corporate security vendor, specifically the Identity Protection Unit. Yes, for an employee. Immediate priority." He hung up and looked at me. "Take the leave." "Sally," he said, "we will code it as personal administrative leave. Full pay for 2 weeks. Use our security guy. He's former FBI. He's expensive, and the company pays for him as a perk for senior consultants. Let him scrub your digital footprint." I felt a lump rise in my throat. I had expected to be fired. I had expected to be seen as a liability, just like my father saw me. "Why?" I asked. "Because loyalty is a two-way street," Mark said, "and because I hate bullies. Whoever is doing this to you, nail them." I walked out of his office feeling lightheaded. I went to my desk. I packed up my laptop. I wasn't going home to cry. I was going home to work. I drove back to my apartment, my mind racing with a new kind of energy. It wasn't the frantic energy of panic. It was the cold, hard burn of calculation. I had Monica. I had Harper. I had a former FBI expert on the way. And I had the one thing my parents didn't think I possessed, the ability to be more ruthless than they were. They wanted to sell the house on Monday? Fine. I wasn't going to burn the house down. I wasn't going to spray paint the driveway. That was amateur. That was emotional. I was going to put a lis pendens on the title. I knew the term because I had worked on a real estate merger once. A lis pendens. A suit pending. It was a public notice filed with the county that announced a lawsuit concerning the property was in progress. As long as that notice was attached to the title, no title company would insure the sale. No bank would issue a mortgage to a buyer. The house would be unsellable. It would sit on the market, rotting, while my parents bled money paying the mortgage and the utilities. I pulled out my phone and called Monica. "Draft the lien." I said, "We are freezing the house." "Sally," Monica warned, "that is an aggressive move. If we file a lis pendens, we have to file the lawsuit immediately. Then file it." I said, "File for constructive trust. File for fraud. File for whatever you have to file to prove that the money they used to renovate that kitchen came from the credit line they opened in my name. If my money is in the walls, then I own a piece of the wall, and they can't sell my wall without my permission." I could hear the smile in Monica's voice when she answered, "Now you are thinking like a plaintiff," she said. I hung up. I looked at the wall of my apartment. My father had given me a deadline. 1 hour to get out. I was going to give him a deadline, too, but mine wouldn't be delivered in a speech at a party. Mine would be delivered by a process server, and it would arrive right before the open house sign went up in the yard. I sat down at my table, opened the spreadsheet one more time, and uncapped a red pen. "Let's see what else you owe me." "Dad," I whispered. The investigative thriller had begun, and I was done being the victim. I was the detective, and I was about to close the case. Monday morning arrived with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. At exactly 9 o'clock, a process server named Dave, who looked like he would rather be fishing, walked up the driveway of the house in Overland Park and taped a notice to the front door. At the same time, Monica Rourke filed a lis pendens with the county clerk. The effect was immediate. The coming soon listing on Zillow vanished. The real estate agent, who I knew was a friend of my mother's from the country club, would have received a notification that the title was no longer clean. The house was frozen. It was a brick-and-mortar hostage in a war they had started. I sat in Monica's office, watching the rain streak the window, feeling a grim satisfaction. We had fired the first shot, but if we fired a shot... My parents launched a nuclear warhead of gossip. By noon, my phone began to buzz with a different kind of activity. It wasn't the silence of the last few days. It was the noise of a community reacting to spin. My Aunt Martha, the one who had clapped at the party, sent me a text message. It was long, rambling, and dripping with that unique brand of passive aggression that only Southern and Midwestern women have mastered. "Sally, I heard about the legal hold you put on the house. I am praying for you. I know you are hurting, and I know money is tight for young people these days. But trying to extort your parents after everything they spent on you is beneath you. Please, just let it go. Don't let that lawyer manipulate you." I read it twice. Extort. That was the narrative. They weren't telling people about the identity theft. They weren't telling people about the forged renovation loans. They were telling people that I was angry about the DNA test and was holding the house ransom for a payout. They were painting me as the greedy, non-biological interloper who wanted to cash out before the real daughter arrived. And the worst part? They were painting Harper as a victim, too. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in 3 years posted something on Facebook. A friend sent me the screenshot. It read, "So sad to see families torn apart by greed. Welcome to the family. Harper. Sorry you have to deal with the drama of people who can't accept their place." They were weaponizing Harper. They were using her existence to validate their cruelty toward me. They were telling the world that Harper was the innocent heir, and I was the bitter imposter who refused to leave the stage without a severance package. I showed the text to Monica. She didn't look surprised. "This is standard operating procedure," she said, not looking up from her laptop. "They are controlling the court of public opinion because they know they are going to lose in the court of law. They want you to feel isolated. They want you to break under the social pressure and drop the lawsuit just to make the whispers stop." I felt a hot lump in my throat. It wasn't just the lies. It was the fact that people believed them. These were people who had known me since I was in diapers. They had seen me graduate. They had eaten at my table. And yet, one word from my father, one suggestion that I was financially unstable, and they rewrote my entire character. But then, the wall cracked. It came from an unexpected source. Late that afternoon, I got a call from a number I didn't have saved. I almost let it go to voicemail. But something made me answer. "Hello?" I said, my voice guarded. "Is this Sally?" It was a man's voice. Rough, hesitant. It took me a second to place it. It was my Uncle David, my father's younger brother. He was the black sheep of the family, the one who drove a truck and didn't wear suits to Thanksgiving. My father always talked about him with a sneer, calling him unambitious. "Uncle David?" I asked. "Yeah, kid." He said, "Look, I'm not supposed to be calling. Your dad, well, he's on a rampage. He's telling everyone you're trying to bankrupt them." I gripped the phone tighter. "That is not true. David, they stole from me. I know." He cut me off. The silence on the line was heavy. "You know?" I whispered. "I know because Bob is an arrogant son of a gun," David said. He sighed. The sound of a lighter clicking in the background. "About 4 years ago, we were at a barbecue. Bob had a few too many scotches. He started bragging about how smart he was with money. He said he had found a way to double dip on his tax liabilities. He said he was shifting debt around to keep his own credit score pristine for the investors. He laughed about it. He said, 'I've got a clean slate because I've got a shadow account.' I stopped breathing. A shadow account. I didn't know he meant you." David continued, "I thought he meant a shell company or something. But when I heard about the party, when I heard about that spreadsheet, it clicked. He wasn't talking about a company. He was talking about his daughter." David paused. "I can't testify against my brother, Sally. I can't do that to the family. But I wanted you to know, you aren't crazy, and you aren't greedy. He's been planning this for a long time." He hung up before I could say thank you. I sat there, the phone warm in my hand. My father hadn't just done this out of desperation. He had bragged about it. He had boasted about using me as a human shield for his financial sins. I called Harper. I needed to know if she was okay. I needed to know if the victim narrative was working on her. She picked up on the first ring. "I am going to kill them," she said. No hello. Just pure, unadulterated rage. "Harper? They sent me flowers," she spat out. "A giant bouquet of white lilies. And a card. 'So sorry for the confusion. We can't wait to properly welcome you once the unpleasantness with Sally is resolved.'" I closed my eyes. "They are trying to woo you. They are trying to buy me," Harper corrected. "They think that if they blame you for the unpleasantness, I will just step over your body and take my seat at the table. They think I want to be the daughter of people who do this." "What are you going to do?" I asked. "I already did it," she said. "Check your email. I copied you." I opened my inbox. There was an email time-stamped 3 minutes ago. The subject line was, "Regarding the unpleasantness." It was addressed to my parents, with copies to Monica, me, and significantly, every single aunt, uncle, and cousin whose email address Harper could find in the family directory Monica had subpoenaed. I read Harper's words. "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Karen Henderson, I received your flowers. I threw them in the trash. You seem to be under the impression that I am a replacement part you can order to swap out a broken appliance. You seem to think that I will sit by while you destroy the reputation of the woman who carried the burden of your expectations for 30 years. Let me be clear. I am not your daughter. I am a witness. And if you think I will ever accept a seat at your table while you are suing Sally for the cost of her own childhood, you are delusional. I do not want your money. I do not want your name. And I certainly do not want to be welcomed into a family that treats love like a ledger. Stop lying about Sally. We all know who the real thieves are. Harper Lane." I stared at the screen, tears finally spilling over. She had burned the bridge. She had taken the golden ticket they were offering her, the inheritance, the status, the real daughter title, and she had lit it on fire to protect me. But the twists weren't over. Monica walked into the room holding a piece of paper. Her face was pale. She looked like she had seen a ghost. "We got the medical records," she said. I wiped my eyes. "The hospital records from the switch?" "No," Monica said. "The pediatric records. From your childhood doctor." She placed the paper on the desk. It was a photocopy of a handwritten chart from 1999. I was 4 years old. It was a note from a routine checkup. Patient blood type, O negative confirmed. Mother A positive. Father AB negative. Note: genetic impossibility. Recommend parental testing to rule out error or anomalies. There was a second note underneath it. Dated 2 weeks later, father declined further testing. Stated clerical error and requested the note be sealed. I stared at the handwriting. 1999. They knew. I whispered. They didn't just know 5 years ago. They knew when I was 4. They knew I wasn't their daughter almost the entire time. My father was a B. My mother was A. They could not produce an O child. It was biology 101, the doctor had told them. And my father, the man who tracked every penny, the man who demanded precision in all things, had declined the test. Why? Monica asked, voicing the question that was screaming in my head. Because I was cheaper, I said. My voice sounded dead. I looked up at Monica. If they admitted the switch when I was 4, they would have had to deal with a lawsuit. They would have had to deal with the scandal. They would have had to find the real baby. It would have been messy. It would have disrupted his career. It would have cost them money and social standing. So they kept me. I said, they kept me because it was convenient. They kept me like you keep a car that has a weird rattle but still runs. And then, when I turned 30, when I started becoming expensive, when they needed to liquidate the house and hide the fraud, suddenly, the health screening happens. They stole 26 years from me. I said, they stole 26 years from Harper. They let her grow up in a house that struggled for money while they hoarded a daughter they knew wasn't theirs, just to avoid a hassle. This isn't fraud anymore, Monica said softly. This is depravity. Her phone rang. She answered it, listened for a moment, and then her expression hardened into stone. Okay, she said, we will be there. She hung up. That was their lawyer. Monica said, they want a settlement conference. Tomorrow morning, 10 a.m. They want to settle? I asked. No, Monica said. They want to capitulate. They claim they are willing to forgive the debt, the $200,000 from the spreadsheet, if you sign a document stating that you have no further claims against the estate and that you will vacate the lis pendens on the house immediately. It's a trap. I said, of course it's a trap, Monica replied. They know about the lis pendens. They are panicking. They need to sell that house before the forensic accountants get full access to the trust. They want you to sign a non-disclosure agreement and walk away. I stood up. I walked to the window and looked out at the parking lot. I saw Harper's car pulling in. She had come to be with us. I am not signing anything. I said, I know, Monica said, but we are going to that meeting. Why? Because, Monica said, a small, dangerous smile playing on her lips. We aren't going there to negotiate. We are going there to deliver the evidence. We are going to lay the pediatric note, the forged loan applications, and Harper's email on the table, and we are going to watch them crumble. I spent the rest of the night preparing. I didn't sleep. I didn't want to. I felt a strange, cold energy coursing through me. It was the energy of the endgame. I organized the documents. Exhibit A, the spreadsheet, the proof of their cruelty. Exhibit B, the loan applications, the proof of their theft. Exhibit C, the pediatric note, the proof of their negligence. Exhibit D, the trust modification, the proof of their intent. I put them all in a simple black binder. It wasn't thick. It was thin. It was elegant. It was the deadliest thing I had ever held. The next morning, the sky was a brilliant, hard blue. Harper drove me and Monica to the location. It wasn't a court. It was a private mediation center downtown, a neutral ground with expensive mahogany tables and soundproof walls. We walked into the conference room at 9:55. My parents were already there. They were sitting on one side of the long table. My father was wearing his best suit, the navy one he wore to shareholder meetings. He looked tired, but he was holding his posture, his chin raised in that familiar arrogance. My mother was next to him, wearing pearls, looking like the victim she so desperately wanted to be, their lawyer, a man named Sterling who cost $400 an hour, sat at the head of the table. When we walked in, my parents didn't look at me. They looked at Monica, and then they saw Harper walking in behind us. My mother made a small, choking sound. She is not a party to this, Sterling barked. Standing up. She is a witness, Monica said calmly. She sat down. Harper sat next to her. I sat directly across from my father. There were no pleasantries. No coffee was offered. Let's make this quick, Sterling said. He slid a document across the table. This is a mutual release. My clients are generous people. They are willing to write off the $248,000 they invested in Ms. Henderson's upbringing. In exchange, Ms. Henderson agrees that she has no claim to the family trust, no claim to the property, and she agrees to a permanent non-disparagement clause. She lifts the lien on the house today. We walk away. Everyone gets on with their lives. My father looked at me then. His eyes were cold, flat. It's the best deal you are going to get. Sally, he said, you can't afford a lawsuit. You don't have the resources. Just sign the paper. Stop this embarrassing tantrum. I looked at him. I looked at the man who had taught me to ride a bike. I looked at the man who had taught me how to balance a checkbook. I didn't say a word. I reached into my bag and pulled out the black binder. I placed it on the table. The sound was soft, a mere whisper of plastic against wood. I am not here to sign your paper. Dad, I said. I opened the binder. I am here to show you mine. I flipped to the first page, the pediatric note from 1999. I watched his eyes drop to the page. I watched him read the words, genetic impossibility. I watched the color drain out of his face so fast it looked like the blood had simply evaporated. You knew, I said. You knew when I was 4. My mother gasped. She grabbed his arm. Bob, she whispered. Bob, what is that? He didn't answer. He couldn't. I flipped the page. The forged loan application. This is a felony, I said. Bank fraud. $30,000 for a kitchen renovation in a house I didn't live in. Sterling, their lawyer, leaned in. He looked at the document. He looked at my father. He pulled his hand back as if the paper were radioactive. Mr. Henderson, Sterling said, his voice low and dangerous. Is that your handwriting? I flipped the page again. The credit card statements, the shadow accounts, $112,000. I said, that is the principal, with interest, and with the penalties you are going to pay the IRS for tax evasion. I estimate your liability is somewhere north of $500,000. I looked at my father. He was shrinking. The arrogance was evaporating, leaving behind a small, terrified old man. You wanted a business meeting. I said, you wanted to talk about investment and return. I closed the binder. Here is the bottom line. I am not signing your waiver. I am not lifting the lien. And unless you want this binder to go to the district attorney's office by 5 p.m. today, you are going to listen to my terms. The room was silent. The only sound was my mother's jagged breathing. Harper reached under the table and squeezed my hand. My father looked up at me. His eyes were wet. Sally, he croaked, we were just trying to survive. I looked at him with a calm that scared me. So am I. Dad, I said, so am I. The formal deposition took place 3 days later. It was not in a courtroom, but the atmosphere was far more lethal than any trial I had ever seen on television. We were in a conference room at a neutral law firm, a space dominated by a mahogany table long enough to land a plane on. My father sat on one side, flanked by his lawyer and my mother. I sat on the other, with Monica Rourke to my left and Harper Lane to my right. But we were not alone. This was the part my father had not calculated, because he had turned my birthday into a public spectacle, and because he had publicly claimed that our financial arrangement was based on a verbal contract acknowledged by the family. Monica had subpoenaed witnesses. Sitting in the row of chairs against the back wall were 5 people who had been at the party. My Aunt Martha was there, clutching her purse like a shield. My high school English teacher was there, looking terrified. The neighbor who had clapped was there. They had been called to testify regarding the statements my father made that night. They were the audience he had craved, and now they were the noose around his neck. My father began the proceedings with the same tired script he had been rehearsing since the night of the party. He adjusted his tie, looked at the camera recording the deposition, and leaned into the microphone. The facts are simple, he said, his voice smooth, practicing the reasonable tone of a victim. The DNA proves she is not my daughter. Therefore, the financial support we provided for 30 years was based on a fraudulent premise. We are simply asking for restitution. We are asking to be made whole. He looked at the witnesses, trying to catch their eyes, trying to rally his troops one last time. It is a matter of morality, he added. Why should we pay for the life of a stranger? Monica Rourke did not look up from her notes. She waited for him to finish. letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. Then, she stood up. She didn't address the DNA. She didn't address the hospital switch. She walked over to the large monitor set up at the end of the table and connected her laptop. "Biology is not a contract, Mr. Henderson," Monica said, "but identity theft is—" The screen flickered to life. It wasn't a spreadsheet of my childhood expenses. It was a timeline. Monica pointed to a date in 2019. "On this date, you took out a home improvement loan for $30,000. She said, "You used the Social Security number of Sally Henderson. You forged her signature. My father's lawyer." Sterling jumped up. "Objection. This is speculation." Monica clicked a button. The screen changed. It showed a side-by-side comparison of the signature on the loan application and the signature on my driver's license. They were close. But the forgery had a hesitation mark on the capital S, a tiny ink blot where the pen had paused. "We have a forensic handwriting expert ready to testify that this is a simulation," Monica said, "but we don't need an expert. We have the email." She clicked again. An email appeared on the screen. It was from my father's work account to my mother's personal account. Dated 2 days before the loan was submitted. Subject: renovation funding. Body: I am going to run it through Sally's credit line. Her score is 780. It won't trigger an audit like it would on my business accounts. I will sign the papers tonight. The room went dead silent. Aunt Martha audibly gasped. The neighbor who had clapped at the party shifted in his seat, looking at the floor. My father's face turned the color of old ash. He opened his mouth to speak, but Monica cut him off. "We are not done," she said. She turned to me. "Sally?" I stood up. My legs felt heavy, but my hands were steady. I walked to the front of the room. I didn't look at my parents. I looked at the witnesses. I looked at the people who had watched me being humiliated and done nothing. "You all saw the spreadsheet," I said. "You saw the bill he presented to me. $248,000. He told you it was the cost of raising me. He told you it was a debt I owed." I picked up the black binder I had prepared. I audited the spreadsheet. I said, I opened the binder to a page marked with a red tab. Item number 42. I read, "Emergency appendectomy, 2004, billed to Sally Henderson, $12,000. I looked at my father. I pulled up the insurance records from 2004. I said, "You had a platinum family plan. The insurance covered 100% of that surgery. You paid a $50 copay." I flipped the page. Item number 86, college tuition, fall 2014, $12,000. I held up a document. I received a Pell Grant and a merit scholarship that semester. I said, "The university records show that the family contribution was $0. You didn't pay a dime." I looked at the witnesses again. "He didn't just bill me for money he spent," I said, my voice rising just enough to fill the room. "He billed me for money he didn't spend. He billed me for expenses that were covered by insurance. He billed me for scholarships I earned with my own hard work. He was double-dipping. He was trying to profit off my existence twice. Once when he claimed the tax deduction, and again when he tried to shame me into paying him back." The realization hit the room like a physical wave. It was one thing to be a stingy parent. It was another thing entirely to be a con artist who used his own child as a mark. My mother started to cry. It wasn't the soft, victimized weeping she had mastered. It was the jagged, ugly sound of someone who realizes the walls are coming down. "Bob," she hissed. "You told me the numbers were real. You said it was a reimbursement." My father slammed his hand on the table. "She isn't our daughter," he shouted. He stood up, his chair scraping violently against the floor. "It doesn't matter what the numbers are. She is a fraud. She has been living in my house, eating my food, using my name for 30 years, and she isn't even—" He pointed a shaking finger at me. "She is nothing." The venom in his voice was so pure, so toxic, that even his own lawyer took a step back. He wasn't arguing a legal point anymore. He was showing the world the rot inside his soul. And then Harper stood up. She hadn't spoken the entire time. She had sat there, watching, witnessing, but now, she walked around the table. She didn't walk toward me. She walked toward them. She stopped 3 feet away from my father. She looked him in the eye. She looked at the man who shared her nose, her chin, her eyes. "Is that it?" she asked. Her voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that silenced my father instantly. "Is that your defense? That because she doesn't share your blood, she is nothing?" My father blinked, caught off guard. "Harper," he stammered, "you don't understand. We did this for you. We wanted to clear the deck so we could bring you home. We wanted to give you what you deserved." Harper looked at him. She looked at the expensive suit. She looked at the desperate, greedy panic in his eyes. "I grew up in a house with 3 bedrooms and 1 bathroom," Harper said. "My dad is a mechanic. He comes home with grease under his fingernails every single day. We never went to Europe. We never drove a Lexus." She took a step closer. "But my dad never sent me an invoice." She said, "My dad never looked at me and saw a tax write-off. My dad loves me because I am his daughter, not because I am a good investment." She gestured to the room, to the lawyers, to the evidence on the screen. "If this is what it means to be a Henderson," she said, her voice shaking with emotion, "if this is how you love, then I don't want it. I don't want your money. I don't want your name. And I definitely don't want your blood." She looked at my mother, who was sobbing openly now. "You didn't lose a daughter because of a hospital mix-up." Harper said, "You lost 2 daughters today because of who you are." My father turned red. A vein in his forehead bulged. He looked at the witnesses, who were now looking at him with open disgust. He looked at his lawyer, who was closing his briefcase, signaling that the fight was over. He realized then that he had lost. He hadn't lost because of the law. He had lost because he had tried to control the narrative, and the narrative had eaten him alive. "You ungrateful." He started to snarl at Harper. Sterling, his lawyer, put a hand on his shoulder. "Sit down, Bob. It's over." And it was. The fallout was swift and brutal, with the evidence of the forged loans and the insurance fraud presented in a deposition. The threat of criminal charges was no longer theoretical. Monica gave them a choice. Settle immediately on our terms, or we hand the binder to the district attorney and the IRS. They settled. My father signed a document admitting to the commingling of funds and agreed to pay off every single debt he had taken out in my name. He had to liquidate his investment portfolio to do it. The house in Overland Park was sold, not to fund their retirement, but to pay the penalties and the legal fees. But the real justice wasn't financial. It was social. The witnesses went home, and they talked. Overland Park is a small world. Within 48 hours, the story of the greedy daughter had vanished. In its place was the story of the monster who billed his child for her own birth. My parents were pariahs. They stopped going to the country club. They stopped going to church. They retreated into a small, rented condo on the other side of the state line, alone with their money and their misery. A week later, I went to Monica's office one last time. There was a final document to sign. It was the order dissolving the lis pendens and the confirmation that my credit report had been scrubbed clean. I sat at the desk. The pen felt light in my hand. "This is it," Monica said. "You are free. You are debt-free. You are tie-free." I looked at the signature line. Sally Henderson. I realized that the name didn't belong to them anymore. I had bought it back. I had paid for it with my trauma, with my courage, and with the truth. It was my name now. I signed the paper. I didn't shake. I didn't hesitate. I wrote my name in bold, clear letters, reclaiming myself from the ledger. That evening, I didn't go to a party. I didn't buy balloons. I invited Harper over to my new apartment. It was still full of boxes, but I had unpacked the kitchen. I made pasta. It was simple. Garlic, oil, chili flakes. Harper brought the wine. It wasn't a $12 bottle of Pinot Grigio. It was a nice red, something with a cork. We sat on the floor because I didn't have a dining table yet. We were joined by Monica, who had finally taken off her lawyer blazer and was wearing a sweatshirt, and by my friend from work. the one who had covered for me during the worst week of my life. We ate, we laughed, we didn't talk about DNA, we didn't talk about spreadsheets. I looked at Harper. She was laughing at something Monica said, her head thrown back, looking so much like the sister I should have had all along. I raised my glass. To what? Harper asked, smiling. I thought about the last 10 days. I thought about the fear. I thought about the moment I walked out of that house with nothing but a gym bag. To family, I said. We clinked glasses. I took a sip of wine. It tasted warm and rich. I finally understood the truth that my parents had never learned. Family isn't about whose blood runs in your veins. It isn't about who you look like. And it certainly isn't about how much you cost. Family are the people who stand up for you when the world sits down. Family are the people who help you shred the invoice. Family are the people who don't treat your love like a transaction. I was 30 years old. I had no parents. I had a sister I was just getting to know. I had a future I hadn't planned for. But for the first time in my life, my net worth was exactly where it should be. I was free. Thank you so much for listening to my story. If you enjoyed this journey of justice and resilience, please leave a comment below telling me where you are tuning in from. I would love to connect with you and hear your thoughts on Sally and Harper's victory. Please make sure to subscribe to the channel Nina Revenge Stories, like the video, and hit that notification bell to help this story reach more people who might need to hear it.